The wind howled through the ruins of an abandoned city, carrying the scent of burned metal and dust. The sky above was dark, filled with thick clouds that never moved. Once, this place had been a thriving alien colony. Now, it was nothing but a graveyard. Ethan Carter, the lone human explorer, stepped carefully over the broken remains of a fallen building. His boots crunched against shattered glass and twisted metal. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and scanned his surroundings. He wasn't here for sightseeing. He was searching for supplies, food, water, anything useful. His ship was parked a few kilometers away, hidden in an old hangar. He had landed on this ruined planet hoping to scavenge what he could before moving on. The war between humans and the alien species that once lived here had ended months ago, but the scars of battle still remained. As he turned a corner, something caught his eye. A small figure, half hidden in the shadows of a collapsed building. Ethan froze. It was a child. A little alien girl, no older than 5 or 6, with pale blue skin and wide, frightened eyes. She clutched a torn piece of cloth in her tiny hands, staring at him without blinking. Ethan's heart pounded. What was a child doing here? This place was supposed to be abandoned. He took a slow step forward, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "Hey there," he said gently. "You lost." The girl flinched and took a step back. Her legs were thin, and her clothes were dirty and torn. She looked weak, as if she hadn't eaten in days. Ethan could see her ribs through the fabric of her dress. Then he heard a soft cough. His eyes followed the sound to a pile of rubble behind the girl. That was when he saw her. A woman. An alien woman, lying against the broken wall. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow. Her dark, violet hair was messy, and her skin was covered in bruises and dirt. She wore a simple, torn outfit, and Ethan could tell she had been there for a long time. The child wasn't alone. Ethan knelt beside the woman, checking her pulse. It was weak, but she was alive. He reached into his backpack, pulling out a water bottle. He uncapped it and gently pressed it against her lips. "Drink," he said softly. The woman's eyes fluttered open slightly. For a moment, she looked confused, as if she didn't believe what she was seeing. Then, she weakly tilted her head and sipped the water. Ethan turned to the girl and offered her some as well. She hesitated but then grabbed the bottle with her small hands and drank greedily. "What happened to you two?" he asked, though he wasn't expecting an answer. The woman opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her voice was too weak. She just looked at him, her bright purple eyes filled with something he couldn't quite understand. Fear, hope. Ethan glanced around. Whoever had left them here clearly hadn't planned on coming back. They had been abandoned. His jaw tightened. He knew how brutal some alien species could be, but leaving a mother and child to die like this, it made his stomach turn. He had a choice to make. He could walk away, pretend he never saw them. He wasn't responsible for them. They weren't human. They weren't his problem. But deep inside, he already knew what he was going to do. With a sigh, he stood up. "All right," he muttered. "Let's get you out of here." The woman's eyes widened slightly. The little girl clung to her mother, as if unsure whether to trust him. Ethan pulled a small emergency blanket from his pack and carefully wrapped it around the woman's shoulders. Then he lifted her into his arms. She was light, too light. She had been starving for days, maybe longer. The little girl gasped and clung to his leg. Ethan looked down and gave her a small smile. "Come on, kid," he said. "Stick close." The girl hesitated, then grabbed the strap of his backpack, following as he carried her mother away from the ruins. Ethan moved quickly, keeping an eye on his surroundings. He didn't know if there were other survivors, or worse, scavengers looking for easy prey. After nearly an hour of walking, he reached his ship. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cargo vessel meant for short trips. But it had food, clean water, and a safe place to rest. He carried the woman inside and gently placed her on a cot in the back. Then he turned to the girl, who was still staring at him with those wide, curious eyes. "What's your name?" he asked. She didn't answer. Maybe she didn't understand him. Maybe she was just too scared. Ethan sighed. "All right, you don't have to talk, but I'll take care of you too, okay?" The girl blinked. Then, to his surprise, she slowly nodded. Ethan pulled out a protein bar from his bag and handed it to her. She took it hesitantly, then started eating. As he watched her, he felt something shift inside him. He had come to this planet looking for supplies, but instead, he had found something much more important. 2 lives that had been left to die. And now, they were in his hands. He wasn't sure what he was getting himself into. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to leave them behind. Inside the dimly lit cargo ship, Ethan Carter carefully placed a damp cloth on the alien woman's forehead. She was still weak, her breathing slow but steady. The little girl sat close to her, gripping her mother's hand, as if afraid she would disappear. Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his short, dusty hair. He had come to this planet looking for supplies, not to rescue an alien mother and her child. Yet here he was, heating up a small bowl of soup from his emergency rations. He knelt beside the cot and offered the spoon to the woman. "You need to eat." The woman's purple eyes flickered open slightly. She hesitated, staring at him with cautious curiosity. Ethan wasn't sure if she understood his words, but after a moment, she weakly parted her lips. He fed her small spoonfuls, watching as she forced herself to swallow despite her exhaustion. The little girl, still silent, watched with wide eyes. Ethan turned to her and offered another bowl. "You hungry, kid?" She hesitated but then slowly reached out and took it. She scooped up the soup with careful sips, eating faster as soon as the warmth filled her belly. Ethan smirked slightly. "Guess that's a yes." For a while, there was only silence, except for the occasional sound of the ship's systems humming in the background. The woman's fingers trembled as she reached up, pointing weakly at herself. "Zisha," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan blinked. "Is that your name?" She nodded slowly, then turned her tired eyes toward her daughter. The little girl placed a small hand on her own chest and whispered, "Nia." Ethan smiled slightly. "Zisha and Nia. All right, I'm Ethan." The girl, Nia, stared at him, tilting her head as if testing the sound of his name. Then, to his surprise, she mimicked it in a soft, careful voice. "Ethan." Ethan chuckled. "Close enough." Zisha's eyes softened slightly, as if grateful. Even in her weak state, she looked at her daughter with motherly love, holding her small hand tightly. But Ethan had questions. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Who left you two out there?" Zisha's expression darkened, and she slowly turned her head away. Even little Nia's face lowered, her tiny fingers gripping her mother's arm for comfort. Ethan sighed. He didn't need words to know the answer. Someone had abandoned them. Whether it was their own people or another group, he didn't know. But leaving them to die in the ruins, that was unforgivable. "Well, you're safe now," he muttered, standing up. "You can stay here until you get stronger. Then we'll figure things out." Zisha's tired eyes looked at him, confusion in them, as if she didn't understand why he was helping. Ethan shook his head with a smirk. "Don't look at me like that. I know I don't look like much, but humans don't just leave people behind." Zisha's lips parted slightly, as if trying to form words, but she was too weak, and soon she closed her eyes again. Ethan turned to Nia, who was now rubbing her eyes sleepily. "You tired, kid?" She nodded. "All right," Ethan said, walking toward a storage compartment. He pulled out a spare blanket and spread it beside her mother's cot. "You can sleep here." Nia hesitated but then curled up in the blanket. She stared at him for a moment before whispering, "Thank you." Ethan paused. She spoke his language. He chuckled softly. "You're welcome." As Nia drifted off to sleep, Ethan sat back against the wall, arms crossed. He had planned to leave this planet soon, but now things were complicated. He wasn't about to dump them somewhere unsafe. He had to think of a plan. But for now, all that mattered was that they were safe, and no matter what, he would make sure they stayed that way. Ethan woke up to the soft hum of his ship's engines and the quiet rustling of movement nearby. His eyes snapped open, his instincts sharp from years of surviving in space. He turned his head and saw little Nia crouched beside the storage compartment, curiously inspecting a small tool he had left on the floor. She held it carefully, as if afraid to break it, but her wide, purple eyes were filled with wonder. Ethan sat up and stretched. "You like tools, huh?" Nia jumped slightly and turned to look at him, her small fingers tightening around the device. For a moment, Ethan thought she might drop it in fear, but instead, she hesitated and then slowly held it out to him. He chuckled. "No, it's okay. You can look at it." She studied his face, searching for any sign of anger. When she found none, she carefully examined the tool again, turning it over in her hands. Ethan recognized that look. Curiosity, the same thing that had made him want to explore the universe in the first place. Meanwhile, Zisha stirred on the cot. Ethan shifted his attention toward her as she tried to sit up, wincing at the effort. Her wounds were healing, but her body was still weak. Ethan grabbed a water container and knelt beside her. "Here, you need to drink." Zisha hesitated, looking at the container, then at Ethan. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She still didn't fully trust him. "I'm not poisoning you, if that's what you're thinking," he said with a smirk. "Go on." She finally took the container with a shaky hand and sipped the water slowly. Nia watched closely, her small ears twitching as if listening for any sign of trouble. Ethan leaned back and crossed his arms. "So, what's your story?" Zisha's grip on the container tightened. She looked away, her jaw clenching. It was clear she didn't want to talk about it. Ethan sighed. "Look, I don't know what happened to you. I don't know who left you out there, but I can tell you one thing. You're not going back to them." Zisha's eyes widened slightly. Ethan pointed toward the ship's entrance. "That wasteland out there, that's death, and I don't leave people to die, especially not a kid." Nia flinched at the mention of death, and Zisha's hand instinctively pulled her daughter closer. Ethan softened his tone. "I'm not your enemy, Zisha. You don't have to tell me everything, but at least trust me enough to help you." For a long moment, Zisha simply stared at him. Then finally she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Exiled." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Exiled?" She nodded slowly, gripping her daughter's hand. "Our people cast us out." Ethan frowned. "Why?" Zisha's expression darkened. "Because of Nia." Ethan looked at the little girl, who was still hugging the tool in her hands. She seemed perfectly normal, or at least as normal as an alien child could be. "What's wrong with her?" he asked. Zisha hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing. She is different. They feared her." Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. He had seen this kind of thing before, people turning on their own because of fear, ignorance, or power struggles. It never sat right with him. "Well, they're idiots," he muttered. "If they think abandoning a mother and child is the right thing to do, then they don't deserve you." Zisha's eyes flickered with something unreadable, perhaps surprise, perhaps gratitude. Ethan stood up and grabbed his jacket. "All right, you can rest, but I need to check the ship's supplies. We're gonna need food if we're keeping 2 extra passengers on board." Zisha blinked. "You are not leaving us." Ethan scoffed. "What kind of man would I be if I saved you just to dump you somewhere else?" She didn't answer, but there was something softer in her expression now, less fear, less suspicion. As Ethan walked toward the control panel, Nia suddenly tugged at his sleeve. He looked down, surprised. The little girl hesitated, then pointed at his toolkit. "Fix, ship," she asked in a small voice. Ethan chuckled. "That's right. You want to help? Nia nodded quickly. He handed her a small wrench. All right, kid. Let's see what you got. As Nia followed him eagerly, Zisha watched them with quiet amazement. Perhaps for the first time in a long while, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Ethan crouched near the ship's maintenance panel, twisting a bolt into place. Beside him, little Nia sat cross-legged, holding a small tool in her tiny hands. She watched him closely, her purple eyes filled with curiosity. All right, kid, Ethan said, handing her a loose wire. Plug this in here. Nia hesitated, looking up at him for confirmation. He nodded, and she carefully inserted the wire where he had pointed. A small spark flickered as the connection was made. The ship's console let out a faint beep, and the screen flickered to life. Ethan grinned. Good job. Nia's face lit up with pride. She turned to Zisha, who was still resting on the cot, her golden eyes watching them. Zisha's expression was unreadable, but something in her gaze had softened. Ethan had noticed that since they arrived, she had remained tense, as if expecting danger at any moment. Now, though, there was something else, something almost like relief. Ethan stood up and dusted off his hands. All right, systems are stable for now, but we're low on fuel and supplies. If we want to keep flying, we'll need to stop somewhere safe. Zisha stiffened at the word safe. There is nowhere safe for us. Ethan crossed his arms. There's gotta be something. A trading post, a black market hub, somewhere we can refuel and grab supplies without attracting attention. Zisha hesitated. Perhaps Corin 5. It is a small station, not well known. Ethan thought for a moment. Corin 5 wasn't exactly a paradise, but it was better than most places. A lawless trading post, hidden on the fringes of known space. If they were careful, they could get what they needed without trouble. All right, Corin 5 it is, he said, moving to the control panel. But if we're going there, we'll need a plan. That place isn't friendly. Zisha nodded. I understand. Ethan started the engines, and the ship rumbled beneath them. He felt the slight shift as they lifted off from the barren wasteland where he had found Zisha and Nia. Looking out the window, he saw the endless desert shrinking below them. For a moment, he thought about how close they had come to dying out there. If he had arrived just a few hours later, they might not have survived. He shook the thought away and focused on flying. A few hours later, the ship emerged from hyperspace, and Corin 5 came into view. The space station wasn't much to look at, just a massive metal structure floating in the void, surrounded by old ships, docking platforms, and scattered debris. The neon lights flickered in the darkness, and dozens of vessels were docked along its sides. Ethan activated the comms. Corin 5, this is the Wayfarer, requesting permission to dock. Static crackled before a gruff voice replied. Docking fees 200 credits. Pay up or find somewhere else. Ethan sighed and transferred the credits. He hated dealing with these types, but they had no choice. The ship landed smoothly on one of the docking platforms. As the engines powered down, Ethan turned to Zisha and Nia. All right, listen up. This place is rough. Stick close to me, and don't talk to anyone unless I say so. Zisha nodded. She understood the dangers of a place like this. Ethan grabbed his jacket and a small blaster, just in case. Then, with Nia holding her mother's hand, they stepped out onto the station. The air smelled of oil, metal, and smoke. Around them, aliens of all shapes and sizes moved through the crowded streets of the station. Traders shouted about their wares, mercenaries leaned against walls watching for potential threats, and shady figures disappeared into dark alleys. Ethan led them through the crowd, keeping a firm grip on his blaster. He knew exactly where to go. They stopped at a small shop run by a wrinkled old alien with 4 eyes and thin, clawed fingers. Ethan, the alien rasped. Didn't expect to see you here. Yeah, well, I need supplies. Fuel, food, and some medical kits. The alien's 4 eyes flickered toward Zisha and Nia. New friends. Ethan didn't answer. You got what I need or not? The alien chuckled. I got it, but it ain't free. Ethan sighed. How much? 500 credits. Ethan frowned. That was more than he wanted to pay. But they needed the supplies. He transferred the credits, and the alien handed over the goods. As they turned to leave, Ethan noticed a group of rough-looking aliens watching them from the corner of the shop. He didn't like that. Let's move, he muttered, guiding Zisha and Nia quickly through the streets. But just as they reached the docking bay, a voice called out behind them. Hey, human, you got something we want. Ethan turned slowly. The group of aliens from before was standing there, blocking their path. Their leader, a tall figure with dark gray skin and glowing red eyes, stepped forward. Zisha tightened her grip on Nia. Ethan stepped in front of them, his hand resting on his blaster. We don't want trouble, Ethan said calmly. The alien smirked. Too bad. Hand over the woman and the kid. Ethan's heart pounded. He didn't know why these guys wanted Zisha and Nia, but he wasn't about to let them take them. He glanced at Zisha. Get ready to run. She nodded. Then, without warning, Ethan moved. Ethan moved fast. In a single motion, he pulled his blaster and fired. The energy bolt struck the ground near the alien leader's feet, making him jump back. Run, Ethan shouted. Zisha grabbed Nia's hand, and they sprinted toward the docking bay. Ethan followed close behind, keeping his blaster ready. The gang of aliens roared in anger and charged after them. The station's narrow streets were crowded, making it hard to move quickly. Traders yelled as Ethan shoved past them. Zisha moved swiftly, her strong legs carrying her and Nia through the chaos. Ethan fired another shot over his shoulder, forcing their pursuers to duck behind cover. Faster, Ethan urged. The docking bay was just ahead. But just as they reached the entrance, two more aliens stepped in their way. One was a hulking brute with thick, armored skin. The other was smaller but had sharp, curved blades on its arms. No more running, the big one growled. Ethan gritted his teeth. You really want to do this? The brute lunged. Ethan dodged, rolling to the side and firing his blaster. The shot hit the alien's thick armor, barely leaving a mark. Zisha, seeing an opening, moved fast. She spun around and kicked the smaller alien hard, sending it crashing into a metal crate. Nia clung to her mother, eyes wide with fear. Ethan knew they couldn't keep fighting. More gang members were closing in. We need to get to the ship, he shouted. Zisha grabbed Nia and bolted toward the docking ramp. Ethan followed, firing another shot to keep their enemies back. The brute roared and swung a massive fist at Ethan. He barely dodged, feeling the air shift as the punch nearly crushed him. Thinking fast, Ethan grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and swung it into the brute's knee. The alien let out a pained growl and stumbled. Go, 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 Ethan shouted. Zisha reached the ship first, slamming her hand on the panel to open the hatch. The doors slid open, and she rushed inside with Nia. Ethan ran after them, but just as he reached the ramp, the brute recovered and grabbed his leg. Ethan crashed onto the metal floor, his blaster slipping from his grip. The brute loomed over him, raising a massive fist. Ethan braced for impact. Then, a loud bang echoed through the bay. The brute stiffened, a look of shock on its face. Then it collapsed, revealing Zisha standing behind it, holding Ethan's dropped blaster. Ethan blinked. Nice shot. Zisha tossed him the weapon. Get in the ship. He didn't need to be told twice. Scrambling to his feet, he rushed inside as the ship's doors sealed shut behind him. Inside the cockpit, Ethan powered up the engines. The ship rumbled as the thrusters came online. Outside, the gang members fired their weapons, but the shields held firm. Hold on, Ethan shouted. He grabbed the controls and lifted off. The ship rose, shaking as a few blasts hit the hull. Ethan twisted the controls, maneuvering past incoming fire. We're not safe yet, he muttered. Zisha strapped Nia into a seat. They won't let us leave easily. She was right. As they approached the edge of the station, two fighter ships detached from the docking bay and gave chase. Ethan gritted his teeth. Here we go. The enemy ships fired, their laser blasts lighting up the darkness. Ethan jerked the controls, sending the Wayfarer into a sharp turn. The blasts missed by inches. Zisha watched anxiously. Can we outrun them? Ethan smirked. Watch me. He pushed the thrusters to full power. The Wayfarer shot forward, weaving through the debris field surrounding Corin 5. The enemy ships followed, keeping pace. Ethan swerved, diving between two floating cargo containers. One of the enemy ships miscalculated and crashed into the wreckage, exploding in a fiery burst. One down, Ethan said. But the second fighter was still on them. It fired a missile, and the warning alarms blared inside the cockpit. Missile incoming, Zisha shouted. Ethan flipped a switch, deploying countermeasures. Small flares shot out from the ship, and the missile veered off, exploding harmlessly in the distance. Before the enemy ship could fire again, Ethan spun the Wayfarer in a sharp roll, locking onto the fighter with his own weapons. Say goodnight, he muttered. He pulled the trigger. The ship's cannons fired, striking the enemy fighter. The small craft burst into flames and spiraled out of control before vanishing into the void. Ethan let out a breath. That's all of them. Zisha relaxed slightly, but she still looked tense. Where do we go now? Ethan checked the nav system. We need somewhere to lay low. Somewhere safe. Zisha hesitated. I know a place, but we must be careful. Ethan nodded, then set the coordinates. She entered them into the system. The ship adjusted course, and in seconds they jumped into hyperspace, leaving Corin 5 behind. In the quiet of the ship, Ethan leaned back in his chair. His heart was still racing from the fight. He glanced at Zisha and Nia. The little girl had fallen asleep in her seat, exhausted. Zisha, however, was watching him. You saved us, she said softly. Ethan shrugged. It's what I do. There was a long pause. Then Zisha spoke again, her voice quieter this time. No one has ever helped us before. Not like this. Ethan met her golden eyes. There was something deep in them, something more than just gratitude. You're not alone anymore, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked down at her daughter, brushing a hand through Nia's hair. Ethan didn't say anything else. He just sat there, staring at the stars as they traveled toward the unknown. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was running. For the first time, he felt like he was heading somewhere. The stars streaked past as the Wayfarer moved through hyperspace. Inside the ship, there was a rare moment of quiet. Ethan sat in the cockpit, his fingers lightly tapping against the controls. The adrenaline from the escape had worn off, but his mind was still racing. He glanced back at Zisha, who was sitting beside her daughter. Nia was curled up in one of the passenger seats, peacefully asleep. Zisha looked up, her golden eyes meeting Ethan's. We won't be safe for long, she said. Ethan nodded. That gang won't forget us. She hesitated. I know a planet. It's hidden, far from trade routes. It's where my people once lived before we were forced to leave. Ethan frowned. Are you sure it's still safe? Zisha took a deep breath. There's nothing left there. No settlements, no cities. Just forests, mountains, and quiet. Ethan thought for a moment. A remote planet sounded perfect. No bounty hunters, no criminal gangs. Just peace. And after everything, Zisha and Nia deserved peace. All right, he said. We'll go there. Zisha entered the coordinates, and the ship adjusted its course. Hours later, the ship exited hyperspace, revealing the planet before them. It was a beautiful world, covered in lush green forests and sparkling blue oceans. White clouds drifted across the sky. It's still here, Zisha whispered. Ethan guided the Wayfarer toward the surface. As they entered the atmosphere, the The ship shook slightly before stabilizing. He flew low over the land, scanning for a safe place to land. There, Zisha pointed. A large clearing lay between towering trees, next to a crystal-clear river. It was perfect. Ethan landed the ship gently, the engines hissing as they powered down. As the ramp lowered, fresh air rushed inside. Naya stirred, rubbing her eyes sleepily. Zisha picked her up and carried her down the ramp, stepping onto the soft grass. Ethan followed, stretching as he looked around. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of trees and flowers. Birds, strange alien birds, chirped in the distance. The river nearby flowed gently, reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "It's beautiful," Ethan admitted. Zisha nodded. "This was my home, a long time ago." Nia ran to the riverbank, splashing her feet in the water. For the first time since Ethan met her, she looked happy. "This will do," Ethan said, "but we still need shelter." Zisha looked at the trees. "We can build a small home here." Ethan smirked. "I hope you know how to build, because I usually just fix ships." Zisha smiled, a rare moment of amusement in her serious expression. "Then you will learn." As night fell, they worked together to set up camp. Ethan used materials from the ship to build a temporary shelter, while Zisha gathered supplies. They found fruit-bearing trees and even a few small animals that looked harmless. Sitting by a small fire, Nia rested against her mother, her tiny hands wrapped around a warm cloth Ethan had given her. The little girl looked up at the stars, her eyes shining. "Are we safe now?" she asked softly. Zisha ran her fingers through her daughter's hair. "Yes, my love. We are safe." Ethan leaned back, staring up at the sky. He knew that wasn't completely true. There was always danger in the universe. Someone could find them. The gang could still be searching. But for now, in this moment, everything was peaceful. He looked at Zisha. She was watching the fire, deep in thought. "You never told me what happened to your people," Ethan said quietly. Zisha's expression darkened. "They were forced to leave. By war. We had no choice but to scatter across the galaxy. Some were captured, some disappeared, and some, like me, ended up alone." Ethan felt a pang of anger. He had seen too many stories like this, innocent people suffering while the powerful thrived. "You're not alone anymore," he said. Zisha glanced at him, surprised. Ethan continued, "We may not have much, but we have this. A new start." Zisha nodded slowly. "Yes, a new start." Nia yawned, curling up beside her mother. Zisha wrapped her arms around her daughter protectively. Ethan stood up, stretching. "I'll take first watch. Get some sleep." Zisha hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, Ethan." He simply nodded and walked to the edge of the clearing, watching the trees sway in the night breeze. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a purpose, and he would do whatever it took to protect it. The first light of dawn broke through the towering trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The crisp morning air was filled with the gentle sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. Ethan sat near the riverbank, his rifle resting across his lap as he kept watch. He hadn't slept much, but he didn't mind. Keeping Zisha and Nia safe was more important. Behind him, the makeshift shelter stood firm. Zisha stepped out, stretching her arms as she inhaled the fresh morning air. She looked at Ethan and gave a small nod of appreciation. "You didn't sleep, did you?" she asked softly. Ethan smirked. "Didn't have to. Someone had to make sure no wild creatures or bounty hunters showed up." Zisha walked over and sat beside him. "You don't always have to fight alone, you know." Ethan chuckled. Force of habit. For a moment, there was silence. The sound of water flowing in the river filled the air. Nia, still wrapped in a blanket, slowly woke up, rubbing her sleepy eyes. She looked around, confused for a second, before remembering where she was. "Is this our home now?" she asked. Zisha smiled, brushing her daughter's hair back. "Yes, my love. This is our home now." Ethan stood up, dusting off his jacket. Speaking of home, we need to build something better than a temporary shelter. A real house. Zisha raised an eyebrow. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Ethan grinned. We've got tools, we got hands, and we've got plenty of trees. I say we get to work. The next few days were spent building. Ethan and Zisha worked side by side, cutting wood, shaping it, and constructing a sturdy home. It was hard work, but neither of them complained. Ethan showed Zisha how to reinforce the walls using materials from the Wayfarer, and in return, Zisha taught him how to use some of her people's survival techniques, how to purify water from the river, how to track small animals for food, and even how to make fire with the resources around them. As they worked, Ethan noticed something. Zisha smiled more. She laughed sometimes, especially when Nia ran around them, trying to help with her tiny hands. For the first time in years, Zisha didn't look afraid. And for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel alone. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Ethan stood back and admired their work. The small wooden house stood strong, with a stone-lined fire pit outside and a secured perimeter around their land. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Nia clapped her hands excitedly. It's beautiful. Zisha placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. You did well, Ethan. He shook his head. We did well. Zisha smiled, her golden eyes warm. Thank you for everything. Ethan gave her a small nod. Anytime. That night, as the fire crackled outside, Ethan sat near the flames, lost in thought. Zisha and Nia were inside, settling into their new home. For so long, Ethan had drifted from place to place, never staying anywhere for too long. He had told himself that attachments were dangerous, that caring about people only led to pain. But here, in this quiet part of the universe, he had found something worth protecting. His thoughts were interrupted when Zisha stepped outside, sitting beside him. What's on your mind? She asked. Ethan exhaled, just thinking about what comes next. Zisha looked up at the sky. We start fresh. We live. Ethan turned to her. And if someone comes looking for us? Zisha's eyes hardened. Then we fight. Ethan grinned. Now that's an answer I can get behind. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt at peace. For the first time in a long time, he had a place to call home. And this time, he wasn't going to lose it.